Okay, good morning. So we're going to carry on. Siman Kuf Nun Ches Yud Aleph. Mevarich Kaidem Netilah. So we're talking about the Netilas Yadayim, and we're talking about when do you actually make the bracha for Netilas Yadayim. I think people don't always do this quite right. Let's see what the halacha says. Says the Mechaber, Mevarich Kaidem Netilah. Really, says the Mechaber, you should make the bracha before the Netilah. Shekol ha-mitzvahs mevarich aleihem over l'asiyason. The general rule is that you do a mitzvah over l'asiyason. So you're holding the apple, you make a ber pru'etz, and you eat the apple. You make the bracha koidem the mitzvah, and therefore you should really make the bracha, says the Mechaber, koidem the netilah, because the mitzvah is the netilah. So you make on Netilas Yadayim and then you wash your hands. That's what the Mechaber says. For nagu, however, the minhag is shelo levarich ad acha netilah. However, the minhag has become that you only make the bracha on Netilas Yadayim after you wash your hands. Mishum depa'amim she'ein yodov nekiyah. Sometimes a person's hands are not clean. And therefore, you only make the bracha after your hands. You've washed your hands and your hands are clean. After the first lot of water has been put on, but before the second lot of water has been put on. Says the Ramah, Gam yochel levorech aleim koidem niguv. He says the Ramah, no, actually you can make the bracha before you begin drying the hands. Shegam haniguv min mitzvah, because the drying is part of the mitzvah, and you can still or mikri over l'asiyason, and therefore it's still called over l'asiyason, that you're making the bracha before the netilah, because although you've washed your hands, the niguv, the drying of the hands, is part of the whole process, and therefore it's still called over l'asiyason. V'im shochach levorech ad acha niguv mavorech achakach. But if a person forgot, he's washed and he's dried his hands, and he said, "Hey, I forgot to say Netilas Yadayim," then mavorech achakach, says the Ramah, it's not too late, and you can make a bracha afterwards. Okay, says the Mishnah Berurah, Sivkot Lamates, over l'asiyason. What does that mean? Koidem v'somach l'asiyah. You should make the bracha just immediately before the actual performance of the mitzvah. Because sometimes you come out of the bathroom, or you've touched part of the covered parts of the body, and therefore you can't make a bracha before you've washed your hands. And that's why our minhag is that we make a bracha after we actually have poured water over our hands. The Mechaber says that you make the bracha after the first pouring and before the second pouring. That was the minhag of his rebbes. Which, like the Ramah says, and that seems to be the minhag ha'olam, that you wash your hands, you make the bracha, and then you dry it. Shegam haniguv, and the Ramah says, because the niguv, the drying, is part of the whole process, and therefore you can still fulfill the mitzvah of over l'asiyason, making the bracha before the performance, before the drying, because that's still part of the process. Shegam haniguv, says the Mishnah Berurah, hu tam acher le'ichu habracha. That's just an explanation of why we delay the bracha. The gam acha netilah choshev oid over l'asiyason, because even after you've actually washed your hands, it's still called over l'asiyason. To gemah netilah haniguv, because the end of the whole netilah of the washing is the drying of the hands, like we're going to say in the next sif. And even if you pour a revius in one go, you don't need even to wipe it. You don't have to dry your hands if you do pouring in one shot. However, we say low plug, and even because whether you pour in one go or you don't pour in one go, either way, you make the bracha after the netilah before you dry your hands. And then the Ramah just finished off and said that if you forgot to make the bracha after you've already dried your hands, you make the bracha afterwards. Because it's not the same as other brachas. Why? Because shal mitzvah dekaimelon she'im lo birch mitchila shuv ein mevarach achach chayav ve'itchi. With other things, once you perform the mitzvah, you've missed the opportunity of making the bracha. The shani hacha, but here is different. Shelo hayaroyin levarach mikaydem, because prior to the mitzvah you weren't able to make the bracha. Shepa'amim she'ein yodav nekiyas, because sometimes a person's hands were not clean. V'lochein afim kvan nigev yodov yuchel levarich oid. And therefore, even though your hands were not yet dry, you can still make a bracha. Avalim kva birch hamoitzi. But once you've made the bracha of hamoitzi, kosva poiskim to shuv ein mevarich on the Netilas Yadayim. Well, then it's too late. Once you've made hamoitzi, then it's no longer possible to make on the Netilas Yadayim. V'hinei ataz machme af lacha nigev sheshuv levarich. The Taz is very strict and says that after you've already dried your hands, before you've even made hamoitzi, you should make the bracha. But after lemaisa ein ninoy kain, even though we are not noyeg like this, and we say that even after you've dried your hands, like the Ramah says, you're still able to make the bracha on the Netilas Yadayim, so long as you haven't yet said hamoitzi. However, the Rabbi Achronim shemaskim Ramah, because the majority of Achronim sides with the Ramah, you should certainly try and make the bracha before you begin drying your hands. And says the Ramah, says the Mishnah, some people make the mistake. They reason, they say suyudechem kodesh, etc. And by the time they do everything, by the time they say Netilas Yadayim, they've already dried their hands. And they're not doing this strictly according to halacha. So let me just summarize. What we've seen that the Mechaba, when should you say the bracha of Netilas Yadayim? So according to the Mechaba, really, strictly speaking, you make the bracha before you even do the Netila. However, you can't do that over here because sometimes your hands are not noki. So therefore, you've got to wash your hands. So according to the Mechaba, what should you do? You wash the first lot, and then you make the bracha, and then you wash the second time. However, the Olim are not noig like this. What the Olim are noig to do is they do Netilas Yadayim, and then they make the bracha kaidem the niguv before the drying, and therefore you fulfill the mitzvah over lasi oson, because the drying is part of the whole process. So you wash your hands, you make the bracha, and then you dry your hands, and that's considered over lasi oson. How long have you got? The answer is until you made hamoitzi. Once you made hamoitzi, you've blown it. If you've dried your hands already, says the Ramah, you still can make the bracha of on the Netilas Yadayim. According to the Taz, once you've dried your hands, it's too late. But we're not knowing like this. We are knowing that you can make the bracha until you've made hamoitzi. Just take a look at footnote 11. He just says over there that so long as the hands are a little bit wet still, then even according to the Taz, you're okay to make the bracha because you haven't, even a little part of the hand is still wet. Okay, let's move on. Yud Beis. V'yenagveim heitev kodim sheyivtza. V'yenagveim heitev kodim. You've got to make sure you dry your hands properly before you actually break the bread. Yivtza is lashon of breaking bread, i.e. making hamoitzi. Sha'eichel b'li nigav yodayim, because if you make hamoitzi without drying your hands, kilo eichel lechem tome, exactly, it's as if you've eaten lechem tome. It says in Mishabur, lechem tome, kosva beis Yosef, this is Sif Cotton Memhei, v'hainu mishum damayim rishonim sheshefech al yod of, because the water that you've poured, the first round of water that you've poured on your hands are tmeim shenitmu machmas yodav v'chudulakama b'simen kuf samachbeis. V'after shefech mayim shniim l'tayim, even though you've poured the second round of water on the hands to be mitay the hands, but you should certainly get rid of that as well through drying it. The Rashal Kosov, the Marshal writes that the real reason for drying the hands is because of nekios. It's just is cleanliness. Because if your hands are still wet, from the water that you washed, it's disgusting. You're holding it like a loaf of some challah or whatever, and your hands are still wet, and it makes it soggy. Don't dry your hands with your jacket or with your clothes, because that causes a person to forget things. Is it dafka your shirt? But what about your other things or your other begodim? Okay, err on the side of caution and just use a towel. Yud Gimel. Hamat bil yodov. Now this is interesting halacha. Let's say you're by the sea and you haven't got water to wash Netilas Yadayim. You can do Tfilas Yadayim. You can be mat bil yodayim. You can dip your hands into a river or into a sea or something like that, or into a mikveh. Says the Mishnah Berurah, says the Mechaba in Siman Kuf Nun Ches Sif Yud Gimel. Hamat bil yodov. Yochel lechol below niguv. Then you don't even need to dry your hands. That's amazing. So you can dip your hands into the sea, and you can, without drying it. And really says the Mechab, if you pour the water on your hands in one go, or you do it on one hand each, then hu hadin, says the Mishnah Berurah, v'lo niguv kein issa b'tosefta v'kosa beis Yosef atamu mishum dematbil ein kamayim tmeim klal. Because when you do Netilas Yadayim, the waters are not tomei, and therefore, strictly speaking, you don't need to dry them. And therefore, the mechaber derives from there that it's also true if you pour revius in one shot, on both hands or separately, like we're going to say in Siman Kuf Samach Beis, ein tzorich niguv. However, we said above, the ikka reason why you're drying your hands is because of mius, and therefore ve'im tahirim heim in tzorich niguv. Sorry, Rashal chelik al zeh, the ikka niguv shetiknu mishum mius, ve'im kein mali revius basachas alo. Who cares if there's revius in one go or not? Ve'rak b'matvel ein tzorich niguv, and just with Netilas Yadayim, you don't need to dry it. The Netilas Yadayim people in Tahara D'Oraisa shel Netilas Haguf, because it's like going into a mikveh, and therefore it's that process that does it. V'sham b'vada ein tzorich niguv, and therefore once you've gone into the mikveh, you don't need to dry yourself to become toha or anything like that. V'lochein gam b'Netilas Yadayim lo tiknu b'y niguv, and with Netilas Yadayim, not Netilas Yadayim, Netilas Yadayim, you therefore do not need to dry your hands. V'chadar of kosav gam ken abach b'simen kuf samachei v'chein eskimu sha'achronim v'af b'matvel ein tzorich niguv min adin. Even though be'emes with Netilas Yadayim you don't need to dry your hands. However, kosav magen ram someone who's got it's appropriate still, even in that situation, to dry your hands properly, even though you do Netilas Yadayim. Okay, so just to summarize, the main thing is, when do you actually make the bracha? You wash your hands in Netilas Yadayim. You can say Su Yadayim if you want to, but then you make the bracha then, and then you dry your hands. Don't do the error of drying your hands and then making the bracha, which is, a lot of people seem to do that, because according to the Taz you should avoid it, but the Eved, according to the Ramah, it works, and you've got Til HaMotzi, but you should, to be Mekayim, the overlast also, and you should certainly wash your hands, make the bracha, and then dry them. Say that. Okay.